The P-51 Mustang saved the American bombing campaign. It won the air war over Europe. This is the legend everyone knows. But for the pilots in the cockpit, the victory was the beginning of the nightmare. 80% of Mustangs lost in the war were not shot down by German fighters. The real killer was different. To understand why, you have to look at a fatal delusion. 1939. American generals have a theory. They call it daylight precision bombing. They believe heavy bombers are the only offensive weapon that matters. Fighters are just for defense. Pursuit aircraft, tools to protect the American coast from an invasion that will never come. The planners ignore the carnage over London. They ignore the Royal Air Force. They have the Norden bomb sight, a mechanical computer that promises to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. To protect this technology, they build the B-17 Flying Fortress. It is a bristling wall of steel, 13.50 caliber machine guns, every angle covered, every approach a death trap for the enemy. The theory is simple. The formation is invincible. Massive fleets of bombers will fly deep into Germany. They will destroy the factories. They will win the war without a single soldier stepping into a trench. The Mustang saved the campaign, but it should not have existed. Planners in the early 1940s considered a long-range escort fighter technically impossible. 14%. That was your chance of coming home. In 1943, the United States Army Air Forces bet everything on a theory of self-defending bombers. By summer, the wreckage of B-17s scattered across the German countryside proved them wrong. The price of that theory was written in the blood of young crews. The math was a death sentence. To finish a combat tour, a flyer needed to survive 25 missions, but with loss rates hitting 8% per mission, the average B-17 lasted only 11 flights. Out of every 10 men who took off from England, 8 would end up dead, missing, or in a prisoner of war camp. Imagine the barracks after a raid. The heavy oak door swings open. 10 beds stand in a row. 6 of them are empty. The footlockers are still there, but the owners are gone. By evening, the orderlies arrive to pack their letters and personal effects. Then comes the dining hall. The clatter of forks against tin plates is the only sound. No one speaks. You don't look at the empty chairs. You just eat your cold stew and wait for the next briefing. The breaking point arrived during Black Week. 2/3 of the bombers sent deep into Germany never flew again. They were either shredded in midair or limped back as skeletons of jagged aluminum. Hundreds of airmen vanished into the clouds. Others dangled from parachutes over hostile territory, watching their planes explode below them. The logistics were a nightmare of attrition. To maintain the offensive, commanders faced a staggering reality. Every 3 months, they had to rebuild an entirely new bomber force. While B-17 crews burned in the sky, engineers on the ground were counting gallons. The math was cold. It was also lethal. The solution seemed simple: fighter escorts. But the Allies were trapped in a cage of physics. The P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived in England by early 1943. It was a beast of a machine. It was also a logistics nightmare. Why not just hang extra tanks on the P-47? The answer was in the engine. The Thunderbolt weighed as much as 2 British Spitfires. Its massive radial engines swallowed fuel. At combat power, it consumed 100 gallons every hour. Internal tanks held 305 gallons. That meant a combat radius of only 165 miles. Even with 75-gallon drop tanks, the reach was pathetic. The P-47 could barely touch the German border, 250 miles from base. Berlin sat 600 miles away. Deep penetration was a suicide pact. The efficiency gap was a chasm. To cover 600 miles, the Thunderbolt burned 260 gallons of fuel. For the exact same distance, the Mustang needed only 108. The math didn't add up for the generals. The escort that could reach Berlin simply did not exist. The generals looked at the math and saw a dead end. The escort they needed simply didn't exist on any blueprint. The solution didn't come from a military think tank. It came from a private company's gamble for a contract. 1940. Britain was suffocating. Their factories couldn't build fighters fast enough to stop the Luftwaffe. They turned to North American aviation with a simple request: build us the P-40 Warhawk under license. The Americans looked at the P-40. They saw an aging machine. They saw a dead end. James Dutch Kindleberger, the head of North American, made a move that seemed like suicide. He refused the order. Instead, he promised to build a completely new fighter from scratch, one that would outperform the Warhawk in every category. The British were skeptical. Retooling a factory for an existing plane took months. Kindleberger made an insane claim. He promised a finished prototype in under 120 days. In an industry where development took years, this was a fantasy. Blueprints hit the tables. The air in the design bureau stayed thick with cigarette smoke. Engineers worked in shifts, sleeping under their desks. They didn't just draw a plane, they reinvented the wing. They used a laminar flow design to slice through the air. 1940 was the year of the gamble. Usually, a new airframe took 3 years to reach the runway. North American had 4 months. The result was an aerodynamic masterpiece. The frame cut drag by nearly 50% compared to its rivals. It was sleek, it was aggressive, it was faster than anything else using the same power plant. The team ignored the exhaustion. They ignored the impossible calendar. They rolled the prototype out of the hangar in just 102 days. The aircraft looked perfect, but underneath the polished aluminum skin lay a fatal technical flaw. Engineers equipped the prototype with a liquid-cooled Allison engine. On paper, it was a beast, pushing 1,000 horsepower. On the ground, it roared with confidence. But as the altitude climbed, the confidence vanished. Why did this brand new fighter fail to protect the bombers? The answer was simple. The engine choked in the thin air. The Allison was built for the lowlands. Once the pilot pushed past 20,000 feet, the power output collapsed. It wasn't a mechanical failure, it was physics. The engine simply couldn't breathe. In April 1942, the verdict from the front was grim. Top brass saw the Mustang as useless for high-altitude escort. The Mustang became a low-level specialist, confined to ground attacks and reconnaissance. It could reach German targets, but only by hugging the earth. It was a world-class frame trapped with an asthmatic heart. The early Mustang models remained tethered to the low altitudes. The fate of the air war changed because one British test pilot asked the right question. In April 1942, Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit of a Mustang serving with the Royal Air Force. He was a professional. He felt the airframe's balance. He noted its speed at low altitudes. But he also heard the Allison engine gasping as he climbed. The Spitfire already owned the clouds with the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Harker knew that engine. He knew its song. Why not put the British heart into the American body? The military elite refused. Every Merlin engine was already promised to British fighters. There were no spares. The system was rigid. But Harker pushed. He saw what the generals missed. Eventually, the bureaucracy cracked. They gave him one Mustang and one Merlin. Harker watched the engineers work. They installed the new 2-stage supercharger. They bolted on a 4-bladed propeller. The engine started with a sharp, metallic whistle, the signature of the Merlin. It was a different beast entirely. The test flight shattered every projection. At 40,000 feet, where the Allison engine would have been a dead weight, the Merlin was just waking up. The Mustang hit 433 miles per hour. It didn't just fly, it dominated the thin air of the upper atmosphere. The data arrived on the desks of the high command. Resistance vanished. Rolls-Royce signed the licenses and shifted Merlin production to the United States. The marriage of an American airframe and a British heart rewrote the map of Europe. The P-51B emerged as a predator without borders. It carried 650 caliber machine guns, 1,880 rounds of ammunition packed into the wings. Later models introduced the bubble canopy. No frames, no metal ribs, just a single piece of molded plastic. Pilots finally saw the world without blind spots. But what gave the Mustang its lethal edge? 2 108-gallon drop tanks. They hung under the wings like heavy steel teardrops. When the fuel ran dry, the pilot pulled a lever. The tanks fell away. The plane became light, fast, and deadly. 1,000 miles. That was the radius. It was a number that shattered German strategy. The Mustang could now reach Berlin, fight a dogfight over the target, and still have enough fuel to strafe trains on the way home. Hitler's headquarters were no longer out of reach. The solution to the bomber crisis had arrived, but the men in the cockpits felt no relief. The long, freezing hours of the escort missions began. The P-51B was a masterpiece of engineering, but a machine is only as good as the man inside. By November 1943, the first Merlin-powered Mustangs reached Europe. The crisis in the clouds couldn't wait. The 35th Fighter Group received the new birds first. The 8th Air Force didn't hesitate. They borrowed the aircraft for immediate escort duty. The need was desperate. Survival of the bomber fleets depended on a plane that most pilots had never touched. Units scrambled to convert. The Mustang quickly overtook the P-38 and the P-47 in sheer numbers. But speed came at a cost. The transition happened faster than safety manuals allowed. Some pilots were literally learning to fly the Mustang on the way to the target. Imagine the cockpit. A young man sits in a cramped seat, roaring through the clouds at 30,000 feet. On his knee, he balances the flight manual. He flips pages while scanning the horizon for Messerschmitts. He has spent less than 24 hours in this seat. Now, he is the only thing standing between the bombers and total destruction. These were children in charge of the most advanced fighters on Earth. They flew deep into the heart of Germany with zero muscle memory. Every switch was a gamble. Every maneuver was a first attempt. The 8th Air Force sent them into the meat grinder with minimum flight time. A flight to Berlin was no heroic sprint. It was a 6-hour endurance test in a freezing cockpit. The mission began in the dark. Pilots studied maps and bomber routes before climbing into the cockpit. At 25,000 feet, the thermometer hit -40 degrees. Inside the cramped seat, the cold became a physical weight. Thick fleece-lined jackets and boots barely helped. Fingertips went numb inside heavy leather gloves. To survive, a pilot had to think through the frost. Fuel was the constant obsession. The Mustang carried a massive tank behind the pilot's seat. It provided the range to reach the heart of Germany, but it came with a price. A full fuselage tank shifted the center of gravity dangerously backward. The aircraft became twitchy, unstable. It refused to fly straight. Standard procedure was a calculated race. The pilot had to burn through that rear tank first. Combat with a tail-heavy plane was a death sentence. Then came the interceptors. Black dots grew into Focke-Wulfs. There was no time for checks. The pilot reached for the release lever. His stiff, frozen fingers fumbled with the cold metal. He pulled. Under the wings, the heavy external tanks broke free. They tumbled end over end toward the clouds. The drag vanished. The Mustang regained its edge. Suddenly, the machine was agile again. The engine roared as the pilot pushed the throttle to the firewall. The silence of the long flight shattered. The heavy drop tanks fell away. Now the P-51 fought on internal fuel. It was light. It was agile. It was deadly. Dogfights didn't last hours. They lasted seconds. A blur of wings, the smell of cordite, and the crushing weight of G-forces. Pilots called it a sensory overload. You tracked a target while someone else tracked you. To survive, you had to see everything at once. 650 caliber machine guns provided the punch, but only if you could hold the lead. Accuracy was the only thing that mattered in a turning fight. The physical cost was staggering. Hours in a frozen cockpit, breathing canned oxygen through a rubber mask. Then, the adrenaline spike of combat, followed by a total body crash. By 1944, losing friends became a line item in a logbook. Some units lost over 50% of their pilots in a single year. Death was the only constant, even for the legends. George Preddy was the best of them. 27 aerial victories. He was the highest-scoring Mustang ace in history. He survived 100 vertical dives and 1,000 enemy bursts. On Christmas Day 1944, Preddy was hunting. The Battle of the Bulge raged below. He chased a German fighter low over the trees, hugging the deck. He was the predator, Suddenly, the ground erupted. American anti-aircraft gunners looked up and saw a fast-moving silhouette. They didn't see the stars on the wings, they saw a target. Heavy .50 caliber rounds, the same ones Preddy used to kill Germans, shredded his cockpit. The noise of metal tearing metal drowned out the engine. One round severed his femoral artery. Preddy likely lost consciousness before his Mustang hit the dirt. The medical report confirmed he bled out in the cockpit. While Preddy's life faded in a Belgian field, his enemies were suffocating under the weight of their own steel. The Luftwaffe had spent months solving one specific problem: how to kill a flying fortress. They built a specialized tool for a job that was about to disappear. Why did the German technical edge vanish? The answer is simple. Their fighters became flying trucks. The Bf-109 and the Fw-190 were once the masters of agility. To drop a B-17, German engineers began a frantic arms race of weight. They bolted 20mm cannons under the wings of the 109. The Fw-190 grew even heavier, carrying 4 20mm cannons and 2 heavy machine guns. Some variants carried 30mm cannons or unguided rockets. The firepower was devastating. Against a slow bomber, it worked. Against a Mustang, it was a death sentence. Every extra gun added drag. Every crate of heavy ammunition stripped away climb rate and turn radius. Above 20,000 feet, the P-51 wasn't just faster, it was a different class of predator. The nimble Mustang tore through these overloaded interceptors like a knife through heavy cloth. The Americans realized the advantage and shifted their entire aerial doctrine. They stopped hugging the bombers and started hunting the hunters. This aggressive pivot, combined with Germany's technical stagnation, shattered the Luftwaffe. U.S. commanders ordered their pilots to clear the skies. The new doctrine of free hunting broke the spine of the Luftwaffe. Previously, escorts acted like leashed guard dogs. They stayed close to the bombers and never pursued the enemy. The Germans simply waited for the Americans to hit their fuel limits and turn back. Then, the slaughter began. By February 1944, the leash snapped. Mustangs now flew 50 to 100 miles ahead of the bomber stream. How much time does it take to train a man for his own funeral? The Germans decided 75 hours was enough. Imagine a teenager in a cockpit. He has 75 hours of flight time. That is less than a modern private pilot's license requires today. He is not a soldier, he is a target. The Americans launched Big Week to bait the trap. They struck aircraft factories to force the German fighters into the air. The Germans rose to defend the plants and flew straight into a wall of Mustangs. In 7 days, the Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters. Their operational strength vanished by half. The numbers were an execution. Germany produced 2,600 pilots per month. America trained 29,000 that same year. It was no longer a duel between equals. It was an industrial-scale cull of novices by veterans. The veteran pilots hunted the panicked recruits through the clouds and followed them down to the deck. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe had essentially ceased to exist. The sky over Germany changed in the spring of 1945. The Luftwaffe was broken, but a new shadow appeared. It moved faster than anything the Americans had ever seen. This was the Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Mustang was a masterpiece of piston engines. The 262 was a leap into the future. It reached 530 miles per hour. That is nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51. In a dogfight, the jet didn't just win, it disappeared. American pilots received a grim warning: do not engage. Unless you have the altitude, unless you have the surprise. The firepower was overkill. 4 30mm cannons. One burst could saw a B-17 bomber in half. A Mustang would simply vaporize. But the future was fragile. At high speeds, the jet was a god. On the approach to the runway, it was a victim. The early Jumo 004 engines were temperamental. They exhaled thick, oily black smoke during takeoff, a clear signal for any hunter in the area. They accelerated like lead at low speeds. Allied pilots stopped chasing the jets in the clouds. They waited for them at home. They hovered near German air bases, watching the perimeter. They caught the Tu-62 when it was slow, heavy, and dropping its gear. Contrast defined the German jet program. It was a technological miracle. It was a logistical corpse. 530 miles per hour in the air. 0 miles per hour on the tarmac because there was no fuel. Berlin moved the production underground into salt mines and tunnels. It didn't matter. They built 1,400 airframes. Only 300 ever reached combat. The wonder weapon arrived too late to turn the tide. The jet era began with a whimper, not a roar. By late April, the skies over the Reich finally went silent. But for the Mustang pilots, the deadliest part of the mission was just starting. The German jets were gone. The dogfights were over. But for the Mustang pilots, the real slaughter was only beginning. Why did the Mustang die from a single bullet while other fighters returned home with shredded wings? Ground strafing became the primary mission. It was a suicide run. The Mustang sat on a ticking time bomb, its cooling system. The Merlin engine was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was liquid-cooled. It required a perfect loop of jackets, tubing, and radiators to stay alive. One rifle-caliber bullet, that is all it took. The projectile pierces the radiator. A white plume of steam erupts from the belly. Inside the cockpit, the pilot smells it, the sickly sweet scent of burning ethylene glycol. He glances at the instrument panel. The needle swings violently into the red. 10 minutes, maybe 20. If the front line is 30 minutes away, he is already a dead man. The engine groans, metal grinds against metal, and the propeller finally seizes into a dead weight. The P-47 Thunderbolt was different. Its radial engine was air-cooled, a 2,400-pound block of steel and aluminum sitting in the nose. It had no coolant to leak and no radiator to puncture. The engine itself was a shield. The numbers tell the grim reality of the low-level war. 8 out of 10 Thunderbolts returned from damage. For the Mustang, that number dropped to 6 out of 10. It was falling to ground fire at 3 times the rate of its air-cooled cousin. The Reich was no longer defending the sky with planes. It was defending the soil with steel. By 1945, the Germans had moved 9,000 heavy anti-aircraft guns into position. Ground targets didn't just fire back. They were part of a mathematical trap. By 1945, the Third Reich had turned the sky into a grid of exploding steel. Over 1 million personnel manned the defenses. They operated 9,000 heavy 88mm cannons. Beside them stood 30,000 light guns, the 20 and 37mm rapid-fire killers. This wasn't a battle. It was a factory of fire. To destroy a train or a truck, the pilot had to play by the gunner's rules. You dropped to 500 feet. You leveled the wings. You flew perfectly straight to aim and fire. For those few seconds, the Mustang wasn't a fighter. It was a sitting duck. The math was brutal. A pilot hit at 200 feet was already dead. He couldn't slide the canopy. He couldn't jump. The parachute needed time that physics wouldn't grant him. If you missed on the first try, a second pass was suicide. The gunners already had the range. They were waiting for the nose to level out. Look at the numbers. Of the 2,500 Mustangs lost in the war, only 550 fell in dogfights. The remaining 80% were shredded by flak or claimed by the ground. The elite aces of the sky were being systematically dismantled by teenagers behind glass sights. A shadow grows over the field as the pilot hits the dirt. The sky was no longer the only executioner. For the 80% who survived the flak and fire, the real nightmare began the moment their boots touched German soil. They expected the Geneva Convention. They found pitchforks and clubs. In 1943, Joseph Goebbels shifted the gears of the state hate machine. He stripped away the titles of lieutenant and captain. He replaced them with Terrorflieger, terror flyers, Luftgangster, air gangsters. The radio screamed that Allied pilots were mercenaries, criminals collecting bounties for every German child they burned. Then came the order from Heinrich Himmler. In August of 1943, he prohibited the SS and police from protecting downed crews. It was a green light for murder. Imagine the descent. A pilot hangs under a white silk canopy. Below, a crowd of farmers gathers at the edge of the field. No police sirens. No military trucks, just the sound of boots running over dry earth and the guttural roar of Terrorflieger. The mob closes in. A shovel hits a shoulder blade. A pitchfork finds a gap in the flight suit. History recorded 3,000 cases of Lynchjustiz, mob justice. Over 1,000 Allied airmen were beaten, hung, or shot by civilians before they could ever reach a cage. Those who survived the frenzy entered the camp system. They didn't find safety. They found slow starvation. By the time the gates were kicked open at the end of the war, many pilots weighed barely 90 pounds. But as the fires in Europe died down, the Mustang's engine was already warming up for a different hell. Iwo Jima waited in the Pacific. Iwo Jima was a jagged tooth of volcanic rock in the middle of nowhere. It became the Mustang's new home in March 1945. The island was small, desolate, but it sat exactly 790 miles south of Tokyo. What is more terrifying, a Japanese Zero or 7 hours over the open Pacific? The distance was the real enemy. 790 miles is the gap between London and Rome. Now imagine flying that entirely over water. One engine failure meant a slow death in the deep. On April 7, 1945, the P-51s took the gamble for the first time. 96 Mustangs scrambled from the dirt strips. They joined 100 B-29 bombers. The target was Honshu. Japanese fighters rose to meet the formation, and the dogfights felt familiar. Mustang pilots claimed 21 kills that day. On paper, it looked like the same air war they had won over Europe. But the combat was the easy part. The nightmare began when the guns went cold and the pilots looked down at the endless blue. In mid-1945, the Japanese fighters became a secondary concern. The Imperial Air Forces had collapsed into a ghost of their former self. Most veterans were dead. The replacements were terrified rookies. Combat turned into a one-sided execution. But the Pacific did not care about air superiority. A round trip from Iwo Jima to Tokyo stretched 1,500 miles. For 7 hours, the pilot saw nothing but a flat blue void. No landmarks, no cities, just the relentless monotone hum of the Packard V1650 engine. Over Europe, a navigation error meant hitting the wrong town. Here, it meant execution by geography. If a pilot's heading was off by just 1 degree, he missed the island. He would fly until the needles hit zero. Then the silence of the engine. Then the waves. The military built a massive safety net to fight the ocean. Submarines sat at fixed intervals across the route. Destroyer escorts patrolled the transit zones. Superfortresses, the Boeing B-29, flew endless search patterns offshore, acting as orbiting lighthouses. Catalina flying boats waited for the signal to drop into the swell. This grid saved dozens. But the ocean is too big for a grid. Many pilots simply vanished before the net could close. In the final months of the war, the math of navigation killed more Americans than the Japanese cannons. The numbers proved it on June 1, 1945. The math of navigation was a cold killer. But on June 1, 1945, the weather proved even deadlier. Pilots called it Black Friday. 184 Mustangs roared off the strip at Iwo Jima. Their mission: escort B-29s to Osaka. Scouts reported a weather front at 10,000 feet. They claimed the fighters could simply fly over it. The scouts were wrong. The Mustangs slammed into a wall of clouds. There was no way over, no way around. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. Pilots flew blind through a nightmare of severe turbulence, sleet, and ice. Formations shattered. Imagine the cockpit. The glass is opaque with frost. The stick vibrates violently. You are 10 feet away from your wingman, but you cannot see his tail. Metal screamed against metal as planes collided in the gray soup. Most tried to turn back. For many, it was too late. 27 Mustangs vanished that day. 24 pilots never returned. Only one fell to a Japanese bullet. The storm took the rest. This single day was a massacre. 27 aircraft is a higher loss than an entire squadron would typically suffer during a month of combat in Europe. The final weeks of the war followed this grim pattern. Between July 1st and August 15th, 85 American pilots died. Only a handful saw an enemy fighter. The ocean and mechanical failure did the work for the Japanese. By the final sortie, the campaign had claimed over 130 Mustangs and their pilots. 130 Mustangs had already vanished into the Pacific. But the statistics hide the faces. One face belonged to First Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg. He was 19 years old, a Jewish honor student from Brooklyn. He found himself on Iwo Jima, strapped into a P-51 during the closing seconds of the global slaughter. On the night of August 14, 1945, Schlamberg sat in a humid Quonset hut. The atomic bombs had already leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Everyone knew the end was hours away, but the orders remained the same: fly. Target: airfields near Tokyo. During the briefing, Schlamberg leaned toward his flight leader, Captain Jerry Yellen. He whispered a premonition. He told Yellen that if he went on this mission, he wasn't coming back. Yellen told him to see a flight surgeon. Schlamberg refused. August 15th, dawn. Parallel realities collided. In a Tokyo recording studio, Emperor Hirohito spoke into a microphone. He was recording the surrender of the Japanese Empire. At that exact moment, Yellen and Schlamberg throttled up. Two Mustangs roared off the Iwo Jima Strip. The pilots flew into a vacuum of information. A single code word, Utah, would have aborted the mission. It never reached their headsets. They reached the target. They banked. They strafed the airfields under a hail of anti-aircraft fire. The two fighters pulled into a steep climb. A thick bank of clouds swallowed them. Yellen punched through the gray ceiling into the sunlight. He looked left, then right. Schlamberg was gone. Yellen circled the white expanse until his fuel needles dropped toward empty. There was no smoke, no wreckage, just the clouds. When Yellen finally touched down on Iwo Jima, the ground crews gave him the news. The war had officially ended 3 hours ago. Philip Schlamberg's body was never recovered. He became the last American to die in combat during the Second World War. The guns on Iwo Jima went silent. Philip Schlamberg was gone. For the Mustang, the global slaughter ended, but the machine's life continued in the hangars. By the end of the conflict, factories had churned out 15,000 Mustangs, a staggering number. What remained of these 15,000 machines that changed the course of history? Most went into cold storage. Grease protected the engines. Dust settled on the plexiglass. In 1947, the military changed the rules. The P for pursuit was gone. Now, the Mustang carried the designation F-51. The letter changed. The danger didn't. When Korea erupted in 1950, the old warriors returned to the sky. They flew from bases in Japan. The range was still there, but the world had moved on. Imagine the cockpit in 1953. The pilot looks at his needle. It pushes 400 miles per hour. Then a shadow passes him. The Soviet MiG-15. It screams past at 550. The jet was 150 miles per hour faster. It wasn't a fight, it was a funeral for the propeller age. By 1953, the Mustang's combat days were finished. The military stripped the armor, they sold the airframes. The survivors became expensive toys for the wealthy. Restored paint, polished chrome, air shows, and applause. The enthusiasts pay millions for a seat in the cockpit. They never have to dive through a wall of flak. They never have to watch the coolant leak while the Pacific waits below. 15,000 were built, only a few hundred remain.